Assalamu alaikum. Marhaba. Ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome. Hello. Thank you for attending our final event in the Islamophobia lecture series, which is hosted by the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. This is the first center that's housed at a U.S. law school that focuses on the civil rights that disproportionately affect Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians in the United States. So for those of you who are students at Rutgers, you should feel fortunate that our administration is willing to support such a center at a time when, as you know, there are consistent and persistent attacks against Muslims and against Muslim communities that go all the way up to the White House. So for Rutgers University to support this center and to support events like today is something that is not common in this country, unfortunately. And hopefully what we'll be doing is setting a precedent so that we can have other centers like this be created at other universities and other law schools. And so before I hand it over to law fellow Maria Ponce, who's the law fellow for the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, and also a 2L law student, I just want to put in a plug for our social media. The website is csrr.rutgers.edu. The Twitter is @RUCSRR, same thing with Facebook. And if you're interested in learning more about what we do, you can visit us on the website, join our newsletter, and attend our events. Next year, the theme of our lecture will be called The Color of Religion, where we will be looking at the intersection of race and religion, which, for those of you who have been keeping up with the attacks against Representative Ilhan Omar, who is Somali American and also Muslim and wears the headscarf, it really brings to the forefront this intersection of race and religion and the phobias and biases against various communities at that intersection. So without further ado, I will let Maria Ponce introduce our speaker today, who I just want to put in a personal word in, is Dr. Amaney Jamal is a personal friend, and I am admittedly one of her fangirls. She has set a track, and she's blazed a trail for people like myself who come behind her and admire her work and her courage. She's been in this field for many years, and I personally am very thankful for the work that she's done, and I'm trying to pay homage to it by building off of it through the work of the center. So it's on a personal level, it's really a delight to have Dr. Amaney Jamal here speaking at Rutgers Newark. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Sorry for reading off of my phone. It's final season, so the law school printers are occupied quite frequently. Our speaker today is Dr. Amaney Jamal. She is the Edward S. Stafford Professor of Politics at Princeton University and Director of the Mamdouh Abbas Center for Peace and Justice. Dr. Jamal earned her bachelor's degree in political science at UCLA, followed by her PhD from the University of Michigan in political science as well. Dr. Jamal is also the director, also directs the workshops on Arab political development, and she's currently the president of the Association of Middle East Women's Studies. And the focus of her current research is the democratization of the politics of civil engagement in the Arab world. Dr. Jamal is also co-principal investigator of the Arab Barometer Project, winner of the best data set in the field of comparative politics, co-principal investigator of the Detroit Arab American Study, a sister survey to the Detroit Area Study, and senior advisor on the Pew Research Center projects focusing on Islam in America 2006, Global Islam from 2010, and Islam in America in 2017. So join us in welcoming Dr. Amaney Jamal.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Thank you so much, Professor Aziz, for your invitation and for the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. It's a really true delight to be here today. And Sahar, I'm going to call Sahar, who's a great good friend, was very kind in her remarks. The truth is, the work that she and others are doing is also really instrumental and path-breaking. So it's really a privilege and an honor to be here. And I love giving this particular talk. I haven't given really this talk before, but the theme of this talk to students like yourselves, because as you'll see, I think this talk is really important for students to sort of comprehend and seize and move forward in terms of their overall studies. So the title of my talk today is Muslim Americans and Islamophobia from 9/11 to Donald Trump. We all know that since Donald Trump was elected president, the landscape for Muslim Americans hasn't necessarily been very rosy. But nevertheless, I always like to start the talks I give on Muslim Americans by pointing out some of the advancements the Muslim community has made over the last several years, right? So Muslims, if we look at data, what we call normally objective indicators of Muslim American success, what we see is that Muslims continue, despite the environment that we live in, Muslims still tend to advance in all professions and are doing quite well socioeconomically. Muslims, as you saw in the most recent elections, we're seeing that even Muslims are advancing and being elected to public office, especially very visible Muslims who embrace their Islamic identity and are embracing Muslim issues. And what you also see in terms of mainstream public opinion is that the younger generation of Americans are far more favorably disposed towards Muslims than, let's say, their elders. Okay, just to give you an idea about socioeconomic attainment, I don't know if I can step away from the microphone. Is that okay? Take it with me? Okay, very good. I just want to see here. So this is looking at, this is from the Pew data 2017, about a year and a half ago, this large sample of Muslim Americans, this study of Muslim Americans was conducted. What you'll see, I want to point you to here, in terms of socioeconomic status, the percent of Muslim Americans making $100,000 a year, right, is at 24%, 29% for immigrants, right, for all the talk about immigrants, 29% for foreign-born, about 30% of the Muslim American communities making above 100,000. The general, U.S. general public, only 23% are making about 100,000. So we see high economic attainment. Having said that, we also still see, so it's kind of like a bipolar distribution, the percent of Muslims making less than 30,000 is about 40%. So there are some successes, but there are some challenges and setbacks still nevertheless. But what we do see is that Muslims are able to sort of, you know, to advance socioeconomically. Of course, the point about US-born Muslim Americans is an issue that we need to talk about, and I'm happy to come back to that in the Q&A. Sort of gets at what Saha was talking about in terms of race, at the intersection of race and religion. Some of the setbacks, though, is that Islamophobia is on the rise, as probably many of you know. Little social desirability bias. What does that mean when we talk about social desirability bias? By and large, most Americans, when we ask them for their true preferences on racial attitudes, whether or not they are favorably disposed towards other ethnic minorities, what we find in the social sciences is that they are able to conceal their racist resentment, if you may. So people will say, oh yeah, I'm very favorable, but when you sort of get at their true preferences, you know that they're harboring some racist sentiment, if you may. So what social scientists call this gap of what people state they believe versus their true intentions, they call it social desirability bias. So you're sort of like trying to be socially desirable and not offend people. Having said that, when we look at attitudes towards Muslims in the US, there is no social desirability bias operating in the mainstream. Meaning, there's no social sanction for being anti-Muslim and stating it publicly and openly. So this is a problem, right? So in other words, Muslims don't benefit from social desirability bias in the country. And when you see that, you know, the sentiment, the anti-Islamic sentiments are sort of emanating from high powers of authority, it sort of creates this, if you may, this legitimating aspect, this legitimating tool of being Islamophobic, especially these open attacks on Ilhan Omar, and a lot of you guys have been watching this in the media and seeing what's going on. Now, I want to focus on this because, you know, by and large, people will say that it's only one person. You know, one person, one congresswoman, Ilhan Omar maybe has been a little bit controversial, has sort of come up, you know, one of those junior congresswomen coming out with an agenda that is very aggressive and potent. But what I want to call to your attention is the fact that she is a hijab-wearing Muslim woman has made her, quote unquote, in the current political climate as a legitimate target from the Islamophobes or from pockets of the society that are Islamophobic. And I want to come back to this. The fact that of all the Muslims, and we don't have many, but of all the Muslims who are elected, she's the one who's getting the sheer burden of the attacks is noteworthy. So, coupled with the controversial statements on Ilham Omar, we also see that there are still pockets in the political establishment that call for a ban of Muslims. There is pressures to continue to surveil mosques. And remember this, and it's easy to blame Donald Trump, but the truth is a lot of these policies have been in effect since 9/11. They persisted through the George Bush years. They persisted through the Obama years. And now we see them basically manifested to an extent under the Trump years. There's been calls for loyalty tests, and even calls to establish a database on all Muslims. As a result, what we see is that number of reported hate crimes in the US has gradually increased since 9/11, with basically 2015 and 2016 seeing a heightened level of reported hate crimes. Remember, only a very small fraction of hate crimes are ever reported to the FBI. So the fact is that you can try to multiply these out by some fraction or some number. This is 9/11, which was like horrendous, both for what happened in 9/11 and for the Muslim American community as a response. But to see that 2015 and 2016 even trumped those numbers due to the electoral campaign, due to the anti-Muslim sentiment that was espoused in the electoral campaigns, is also eye-opening. When we poll Muslims, this is in the Pew survey of 2017, when we poll Muslims, by and large, Muslims understand that they are a target of discrimination in the country. 75% believe there's a lot of discrimination against Muslims in the US. Does Donald Trump make you feel worried? 68% say yes. Do American people see Islam as part of the mainstream society? 62% of Muslims say no. They don't feel that Islam is an integrated part of the mainstream religions of the United States. And in recent years, being Muslims in the US has gotten more difficult. About 50% say it's gotten more difficult. 44% say nothing has changed. So you're already on a challenging playing field, and so nothing has changed since 9/11. This is sort of sad, and I want to come back to this because despite all the efforts of Muslim organizations to sort of counter the negative public relations campaign, that still you see these numbers as sort of staggering. Okay, religious discrimination. By more or less, 1 in 2 Muslims has experienced discrimination. And most of it is basically they're either being treated with suspicion, singled out by airport security or called offensive names, singled out by other law enforcement, or physically threatened or attacked. So that's like 1 in 2 of the Muslim community has experienced forms of discrimination. And we see that these levels from 2007, 2011, 2017, everything's on an upward trajectory there. Okay. Now, while the Muslim American population generally is experiencing a lot of discrimination, it appears that new data has shown, and this is why the example of Ilham Omar is important, that women are absorbing a good percentage or proportion of that discrimination. So among those people surveyed who look Muslim, and we all know that women who wear the hijab are much more identifiable as Muslim, 64% of them report being discriminated against. Among those who do not look Muslim, 39% report being discriminated against. So there's a significant gap. So discrimination exists for everyone. But women seem to be seem to be targets of discrimination more so than men. And we see this across several polls in the United States, whether it was the Pew polls or the ISPew polls conducted recently. Women are complaining a lot more. Again, when you sort of think about the Donald Trump comments against Ilhan Omar, she's a hijab-wearing female, it sort of exacerbates and compounds the dilemma for Muslim American women as well. Nevertheless, we want to focus on some positive components. This is one of the slides I like to show the most, because what I don't want to do is just to give a talk about, oh, look at you guys, Islamophobia is so bad and everybody's so challenged and it's just getting worse. We want, especially for students, to sort of leave this conversation with tools that can that show at least an optimistic path forward. So there is a growing number of U.S. Muslims say they have received expressions of support, right, from the mainstream. And so if you see in 2007, only about a third of the Muslim American population say that they received an expression of support. By 2011, that percentage was 37%. And by 2017, it is now 49%, or 50% of Muslims say that they have received mainstream gestures of support. These gestures of support in other polls that we've examined in the mainstream basically are coming out from the youth population. So the younger generation of mainstream Americans have been more supportive. And why? We also find that students at colleges, younger generation who have interacted with Muslims, met a Muslim, know a Muslim, they are far more positive. So yes, there's this tide of Islamophobia, but it seems that at least in the younger generation of mainstream Americans, this Islamophobia is not being embraced at the same magnitude as it was, let's say, about a decade earlier. So one of the things that consistently still operates, in my opinion, against the Muslim American accomplishments is the media. When we ask, the funny thing is, when we ask Muslims and the general public, the US non-Muslim general public, do they think that the media is unfair towards Muslims? Look at 60% of US Muslims say the media is unfair. We know that. But 53% of the general public also says the media is unfair to Muslims, right? So there is this growing sort of understanding and consciousness, if you may, that Muslims are not getting a fair shake, if you may, in the US media. Do American people see Islam as part of the mainstream society? 62% of Muslims say no, but look, another 50% of the general public says no, that they're not seen. So there, again, this idea that there might be this growing consciousness among the mainstream about Islamophobia and its consequences. Okay. And I know there's a lot about how the media covers terrorism and it basically singles out Muslims and whatnot. A lot of new studies have been conducted recently. I'm going to show you just a couple of them that show that not only is the media unfair in terms of how it covers quote-unquote terrorism and it labels terrorism, it defines terrorism, but just look at some of the trends that are emerging in content analysis type of studies where people are sort of really analyzing media versus the actual events in society. So this is a 2017 Georgia State University study. Controlling for target type, fatalities, and being arrested, attacks by Muslim perpetrators received on average 357% more coverage than other attacks. So just if the perpetrator is a Muslim, you're almost guaranteed that that incident is going to receive a disproportionate amount of coverage in the media. According to the ISPew report, equal treatment question mark, if it's online, someone perceived to be Muslim accused of a terror plot will receive 7.5 times the media coverage as someone not perceived to be Muslim, which basically sort of builds onto this mathematically, right? So a bunch of studies are showing this, that Muslims are going to be receiving a lot of attention for these negative attacks. I want to come back to another slide, but really quickly I want to show you this one. that sort of like gets at contact theory, contact hypothesis, whether or not you know somebody. What we also see is that for the students here, Islamophobia is very much a polarized partisan issue in the country. This is attitudes towards Muslims. Republicans are the orange, the blue are the Democrats. You'll see that favorable attitudes towards Muslims, 67% of Democrats say they have a favorable attitude, 41% of Republicans, 58% of Republicans say they have an unfavorable attitude towards Muslims. Just keep your focus here. Attitudes towards Muslims, if you know a Muslim, I know some very well. The Republicans, the Democrats, among Democrats, if you know them very well, 82% of Democrats are favorable, but even Republicans here, 73% become favorable, right? So although up here the Republicans are unfavorable, if they know a Muslim, they're about 73% more likely to have favorable opinions. So a lot of this Islamophobia is based on not even knowing a Muslim or meeting a Muslim or encountering a Muslim. Similarly, you see a similar trend here. This is attitudes towards Islam, not Muslims, but basically, by and large, a similar trend. Furthermore, public opinion polls, and this is always something I tell my students to keep in their back pockets. If you ever find yourselves debating somebody who says, well, Muslims are violent, Muslims are more likely than the general public to reject violence against civilians by the military. 71% of Muslims versus 42% of the general public reject it. And they are likely to reject violence carried out by an individual or small group, 80% of Muslims versus 74% in the general public. According to Pew's 2017 survey of Muslim Americans, although both Muslim Americans and the US public as a whole overwhelmingly reject violence against civilians, Muslims are more likely to say such actions can never be justified. 3/4 of US Muslims say this compared with 59% of the general public. So keep this sort of like in your back pocket. Now, for all the coverage of Muslim terrorism in the US, this is a slide I like to show. In 2014, the FBI labeled 6,688 terrorism cases in the United States, right? Of course, we probably didn't see all of them in the media, but there were 6,688 terrorism cases. What percentage of Muslim Americans were involved in these terrorism-related attacks? Right? Normally, what people will say is that, well, the proportion of the population should be equally represented in the proportion of attacks, right? So if Muslims are, what, 2-3% of the US public, maybe 3% of the attacks should be Muslim. 3% of 6,888, right? Do the math. We're dealing with like hundreds of cases, right? Lo and behold, only 35 Muslim Americans were involved in these 6,688, far less than the proportion of Muslims as part of the general population. Yet, the way the media covers these events, you'd think that the Muslims are maybe responsible for over 50% of those 6,688 cases. Oftentimes, Muslim religiosity, this culpability, this burden that Muslims have to carry as if they are responsible for terrorism and violence, really has a daunting effect on the community. Muslims are the most likely faith community. When we surveyed all Muslim faith communities, actually no, this is not a Pew survey, this was a non-Pew survey, but when Muslim faith communities where all faith communities were surveyed in the US, the Muslims are the most likely faith community to say they strongly agree, 44%, with the following statement: when I hear that a member of my faith community committed an act of violence, I feel personally ashamed, right? So in other words, like if a Muslim commits a crime, a Muslim who you've never seen or known or heard of, right? The entire community sort of feels collectively responsible. 44%, that is huge, that is tremendous. This compares to roughly 1/3 of Jews, Catholics, Protestants, and white evangelicals. Okay, really quick, I know I want to leave some time for Q&A, but there's an assumption that the religiosity of Muslim Americans is so different as it prevents assimilation, that there's something so unique or specific about the way Muslims observe. So, just looking at religious practice in the US, 40% of Muslims attend mosque at least once a week, but 39% of Christians in the US also report that they attend church at least once a week, right? 90% of Muslims report that religion is very important to them, but 83% of the general population also says that religion is very important to them. So this idea that Muslims are like hyper-religious or so different in their patterns of worship and practice that it separates them from the general public, this is not substantiated with existing data. Okay, so looking ahead. Muslims are making little progress on the public relations campaign in this country. I still can't tell you how many times I give talks across the country and people will say, well, why aren't there more Muslims like you to sort of denounce terrorism or to speak against violence? And it's like, you know, quite honestly, if you haven't heard that Muslims are denouncing violence and speaking against terrorism by now, you're just not looking, you're not listening. Or you're not wanting to listen to that message. Muslims have, if you think about Muslim civic life, Muslim organizational life, they have basically invested millions of dollars in the last decade into the public relations campaign, and still they're really hitting it very slowly. The changes are happening very incrementally. But it doesn't mean that Muslims also, and I say this often, like I don't want to apologize for something that I'm not responsible for, right? I want to talk about what I've accomplished. I think every one of you should talk about what you've accomplished, what you're going to accomplish. Your accomplishments are your own, and you should basically feel okay to state that you don't need to apologize for things that you're not responsible for. Furthermore, holding national and public officials accountable when they make inflammatory statements, when they go after our Muslim representatives, that is actually your obligation and your civic duty. Through the democratic process, through petitioning, through contacting your local representatives, don't allow these witch hunts, if you may, to go unaccounted for. There are legitimate means to sort of object to ways certain things are handled in this country. We need to acknowledge, though, that Islamophobia is not only anti-Muslim, it is anti-American. And that's the platform in terms of enhancing the circle, making sure we have allies and alliances on this issue to basically discriminate and marginalize an entire faith community based on their identity is itself anti-American. Some of the good news, again, the Pew surveys find that those in college and more educated have better views of Muslims, those who know more about Islam, so it's your obligation to educate people about Islam, but sometimes it just requires you to say to somebody, they might say, oh, you're so cool, you're so great. You say, yeah, and I'm Muslim, right? And they'll be like, wow, you know, I didn't know you were Muslim. For women who wear the hijab, of course, you know, it's sort of given, but everybody sort of has an obligation not to sort of step up and embrace who they are. Trump has forced a mainstream positive response, and we want to be aware of that and sort of seize the momentum on that one as well. And finally, nevertheless, but these attacks on officials like Omar, they are basically stifling. They may inhibit people from engaging and participating in the political process. You need to be cognizant of it, about this. It's kind of like this way of like, to sort of deter people from participating in political life. If you're a Muslim, why step up and participate in political life? It might be easier just not to stay out of the limelight, if you may. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, I look forward to your questions. That's basically my presentation. Thank you so much for attending.